earlier this week in our basic Judaism class here at CBE, I taught an annual lesson, which I know some of you in this room either heard this week or heard in years past, that I call History of the World Part 1. And in so doing, I introduced the uninitiated to, of course, the work of our sage, Mel Brooks. I see some nods in the back, but more importantly, offering them a taste of the earliest origin stories of our people. And while the name is about the only thing that the class shares with the film, I do start out with the Bible, as does he in that movie. As we first encounter Abraham, I invite students to read an early prophecy that he receives in Genesis 15. Know well, God tells him, that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed. The text goes on in Genesis to presuppose the exodus from Egypt, and in a number of ways, it presages the arc of Jewish history through the modern period, journeying and returning and moments of oppression. As we know, even the early name attached to Abraham, Ivri, a person who has come from somewhere else, gives us an eerie prophecy of what would unfold for our famously peripatetic people. Now, even the most skeptical Jewish readers can't help but look at this episode and so many others from the book of Genesis as uncanny predictions of Jewish history. Ramban, Nachmanides, the great medieval sage, teaches that when we read of the journeys our ancestors took or the wells they dug in Genesis, even the minor details are clues of what will happen in the future. I have probably a somewhat less mystical attitude toward the text, but in this week's slice of Genesis, I am thinking about those wells in particular. Admittedly, each year when we get to this parsha, Parshat Toldot, I actually end up obsessed with Isaac and the wells that he digs. Vayashov Yitzchak, vayachpor et be'erot hamayim asher chafru b'mei Avraham aviv. Isaac dug anew the wells which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham. Apart from nearly being sacrificed by his father and playing favorites with his sons, redigging Abraham's wells is the thing for which Isaac is most famous. It always gives me pause to consider a man who had a complicated relationship with his father, revisiting that father's actions quite literally in the wells that his father dug. It's hard to imagine a more perfect metaphor for our own interrogating of the Jewish past than the redigging of Abraham's wells. And as I think about that powerful imagery, I sometimes forget why those wells were stopped up in the first place. Going back just a few verses, we learn the answer. At the beginning of chapter 26, the Torah explains that a famine besets the land of Canaan. Like Abraham before him, Isaac chooses to go to a neighboring territory to wait out the famine and seeks refuge under the auspices of the Philistine king, Avimelech. While he's there, Isaac sows his fields and becomes wealthy. But the Philistine people become jealous of the capital that he amasses during his stay in their territory. So, in verse 15, we read that the Philistines had stopped up the wells that Abraham had dug, filling them with earth. Now here, this week, as I redug the wells of this familiar parsha, I saw something that I had previously overlooked. Immediately after the Philistines fill in Abraham's wells, Avimelech casts Abraham away. Lech me'imanu, he says, go away from us. Ki atzamta mimenu me'od, for you are much mightier than we are. And here too, in just one ancient verse, we hear echoes of more recent Jewish history. A strange people dwelling in a foreign land, stoking the ire of the majority population for their accomplishments. We think of medieval European critiques of Jews perceived to be taking advantage of societies to which they didn't really belong. Or closer to home, we think of contemporary conspiracy theorists condemning Jews for wielding influence and power that far surpasses our numbers. And though it wasn't the way I first understood it, Jewish commentaries seem to take the connection between Isaac and this sort of proto-anti-Semitism almost for granted. The typical reading of that word atzamta mimenu me'od, is as found in the JPS translation, "You have become far too big for us," or alternatively, "Thou art much mightier than we." This reading understands the mem in mimenu as comparative, mightier or bigger than we are. But a number of midrashim understands the mem, that first mem, that letter of the word, in its other prepositional context as from us. Breshit Rabbah reads the mem this way, explaining Avimelech's words to mean, all the might that you have gotten, is it not from us? Formerly you only had one flock, and now you have many. Now, looking at the plain sense of the Torah text, we don't read that Isaac did this. The text never says anything about Isaac taking advantage of the Philistines. In fact, it states somewhat matter-of-factly, Vayizrach Yitzchak, Isaac sowed in that land, and seems to imply that the bounty he harvested was a miracle bestowed upon him by God, reaping much more than he ever anticipated after sowing all by himself. So, the Midrash explains, the Philistines stop up his wells because they are outraged either by the blessings that God bestows upon him, or in a more secular reading, they're outraged by his own accomplishments. When we read this Midrash, we might not read it that way. We might not see the original text that way, or we might feel ambivalent about it. We in this congregation have grown accustomed to nuanced views of our own power and what our privilege affords us in America. And our experiences do not incline us to view Isaac primarily as the victim of this kind of proto-anti-Semitism. And as we read the commentaries of earlier generations of Jews, and it's really almost all of those commentaries on this particular section, we get a glimpse of what was foremost on their minds, referring to the realia of their own experience with greater powers. An 18th century Italian commentator known as Yashar explains that when Avimelech sends Isaac away, it is not because Avimelech is angry about Isaac, or even angry with him, or even afraid of him. Rather, Avimelech is an insecure leader, worried about a populist uprising against him if he allows Isaac to stay in that land. And his treatment of Isaac was similar to the ways in which European leaders responded to pressure from their own underclasses. Moshe Alshich, a rabbi from 16th century Turkey, takes a similar view. He teaches that Avimelech was content to allow ruffians to stop up Isaac's wells, dropping the hint that he was no longer welcome, so the king could avoid a political controversy until it became necessary to take state action. And perhaps this too was a mirror to what Alshich saw in his own time. One other commentator, the Netziv from 19th century Germany, takes a different approach, albeit from a similar vantage point. In his reading, the Philistines most upset about Isaac were the wealthy ones, who compared their own wealth and power to what Isaac had amassed. Even if the Philistines weren't all jealous, and even if Avimelech didn't want to expel Isaac, the upper classes in power left him with no choice. The Netziv spells this one out for us, comparing this experience directly to the Jews in his time living in the Pale of the Settlement and the non-Jewish bourgeoisie afraid of them. As modern Bible commentator Nechama Leibovich writes, looking at these commentaries and more, from then to our own days, the voice of those making this accusation has never been silenced, and in this respect, the experience of the fathers are a symbol for their descendants. Fortunately for many of us, we don't immediately see echoes of our own experience in the Parsha's depiction of Isaac. But as we redig the wells of this story, using the Jewish tools at our disposal, we find in our excavations remnants of our own more recent history. As soon as we open our ancient and medieval commentaries, we learn less about Isaac than we do about the ancestors who commented on him over the last 2 millennia. Our stories and our understanding as time, or of time, as Jews, bring us to a circular relationship with the past, especially when we read Genesis. And for those of us fortunate enough not to be confronted by the kind of daily pain our ancestors endured, may we find in our digging, especially over the coming weeks as we continue to read this book of Genesis, may we find prophecies of a better future and reasons for hope, alongside the ancient perspective of our people. Shabbat Shalom.